Today I will be discussing Yippies, the Anti-Riot Act, the 1968 Democratic National Convention, and the trial of the Chicago 8. Yippies stand for Young International Party. They were simply politically active hippies. Yippies were founded in December of 1967 by Abbie Hoffman and Jerry Rubin. They were an anti-war activist group that believed in doing your own thing and not conforming to anything. They believed in social justice, anti-capitalism, anti-establishment, the legalization of marijuana, and most importantly, stopping the Vietnam War. The Yippies would gather in large cities and protest against the war in theatrical ways that have never been done before. The Yippies were famously known for the theatrical stunts they would pull, which set them apart from any other anti-war groups. Getting the attention of the media was very important to the group and was one of their main goals. Media was a big influential tool to get the message out to people about Yippies and about ending the war. Pictured below is the group flag. The pin on the right shows you the attitude the Yippies had because they were anti-capitalist. As I mentioned earlier, the Yippies were big on theatrical stunts. Here are some of their most iconic protests. First was at the New York Stock Exchange in 1967. A group of Yippies joined a tour of the place, and once they were on the balcony, they threw down tons of fake and real dollar bills and laughed as everyone fought each other for the money while guards had to escort people out. Next, we have the Disneyland protest. On August 6, 1970, which was purposely the 25th anniversary of the Hiroshima bombings in Japan, about 300 Yippies went to Disneyland to protest. The reason they chose Disneyland is because the Bank of America was one of Disneyland's biggest sponsors, which were supporters of capitalism. The Yippies caused Disneyland to shut down early, which was the second time it had ever done that, the first time being when John F. Kennedy was assassinated. Next, the Yippies levitated the Pentagon. The idea was that if they gathered around the Pentagon and chanted rituals, that they could get the Pentagon to levitate off the ground, and then all the evil would be gone, therefore ending the war. This also shows you how much marijuana the Yippies smoked. The Pentagon did not actually levitate, but it was an iconic idea and shows that the Yippies were full of absurd ideas to protest the war, which got tons of attention from the media. On the left side of the page is a picture from the New York Stock Exchange. The man with the curly hair is Abbie Hoffman, which was one of the founders of the Yippies. The picture really shows you how the Yippies pulled their stunts. They were always laughing, very free-hearted people. The picture on the right side shows Yippies holding hands as they walk around Disneyland protesting. The Yippies were a big part of America's counterculture. The Anti-Riot Act was passed April 11, 1968. It was created to try and stop the riots and protests over the Vietnam War, which were happening frequently in many cities. The act made it a federal crime to cross state lines with the intent to riot. The next topic is the 1968 Democratic National Convention. Before I get into what it was, it is important to note the events that led up to this iconic riot. Martin Luther King Jr. had been assassinated that April. One of the Democrats' presidential nominees had been assassinated. The Tet Offensive had taken place, and about 300 men were getting killed every week in Vietnam, along with President Johnson still sending more troops there. Riots were uprising in over 120 different cities, making it harder for police to control. All of these events made it seem as if the United States was falling apart. The Democratic National Convention is held for Democrats to nominate their presidential candidate. President Johnson had dropped out of the race, so the choices were Senator McCarthy, who wanted to stop the war, Vice President Humphrey, who was seen as the representative of Johnson's view, which is continuing the war to avoid communism, and Senator George McGovern, who appealed to some of Kennedy's supporters. At the National Democratic Convention of 1968, there were anti-war activists that protested. Protesters wanted to break with the past and stop the election in support of anyone who wanted to continue the war. They wanted the world to know that there were thousands of young people who didn't want to see another 4 years of war. A group of 8 men from different anti-war activist groups founded the idea to riot on this day. The final decision was to have as many people come to Chicago to protest. In March of 1968, a meeting was held where they created and distributed a document about what they intended to do. It's important to note that it recommended nonviolence, which is ironic because of the outcome. The leaders of the Yippies came up with the idea to hold a Festival of Life in Lincoln Park. They planned to have bands come play and encouraged people to come camp out in the Chicago parks. The festival was going to be held on the days of the convention. Now that all the plans had been set for the protest, the police heard about their intention to camp in the parks and made a curfew of 11 p.m. to prevent this from happening. When people heard about this, it stopped a lot of people from coming to the riot, ultimately leading to a failed festival. On the first day of the convention, the city of Chicago got prepared for the rioters, expecting a lot of violence. The city called in 12,000 police officers, 15,000 state and federal officers, and even the SWAT team, who were told to shoot to kill if necessary, all to help contain the protesters and prevent any violence, which didn't help in the end. After people heard of the precautions the city was taking, a lot of people did not show up, but that did not stop thousands of protesters filling the streets of Chicago. At the Festival of Life, only one band showed up. At 10:30 p.m. that night, police warned protesters that if they were not out of the park by the new curfew at 11 p.m., that they would force them out. When protesters refused to leave, police started beating people with billy clubs and used tear gas on them. This was the first time in history that police treated protesters so violently and is remembered tragically by many. Some effects of the convention were how it angered the U.S. and made people lose all hope of the good in people and the ending of the war. It tore apart the Democratic Party, making their views change and oppose one another. It also caused the Democrats to lose the next presidential election to Nixon. These brutal pictures show you just how awful and violent the riot was. There was a lot of blood, the police beat a lot of people, and it was an awful riot. Another effect the Democratic National Convention had was the trial of the Chicago 8. As I mentioned before, the group of people who organized the protests that took place at the Democratic Convention planned the riots and made a 21-page document stating what they intended to do. The 8 men on the trial were the founders of Yippies, Abby Hoffman and Jerry Rubin, along with other leaders of anti-war groups, David Dellinger, Tom Hayden, Rennie Davis, Dave Fronos, and Lee Weiner. The 8 men were charged with conspiracy to cross state lines and incite a riot, breaking the Anti-Riot Act that was established in the previous April. The charges were because of the outbreak of protesters at the Democratic National Convention. The trial lasted 5 months. At the trial, the defendants and their attorneys used it as a platform to attack the war, racism, Nixon, and oppression. The yelling got so crazy that the judge had to order one of the defendants to be strapped to their chair. In the end, the jury declared the Chicago 8 not guilty of conspiracy, but found all but 2 guilty of intent to riot, and then the 6 of them were charged $6,000 and sentenced 5 years in prison. None of them ended up serving time, however, because in 1972, a court of appeal overturned the criminal convictions and all charges were dropped. That concludes the end of my presentation. Today I will be discussing